Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Life is a story we tell ourselves. Our topic today is about the continuing mysteries that surround Easter Island. So here with us today is Josie Nahoe Mulloy, and she's going to shed some light on some of these mysteries. She's an active member of the Easter Island Guides Association and has worked as a guide at Rapa Nui for 23 years. But more than that, she has a personal connection with the island. Her father is a native-born Rapa Nui, and her maternal grandfather is the famous archeologist who did years of work on the island, Dr. William Mulloy. Since our podcast attempts to inspire our listeners through stories about the individuals on this program, we're going to start off with a little bit of personal history and Josie's relationship to Rapa Nui. Josie, why don't you tell us a little bit about your ancestry and personal connections to Rapa Nui?
Great. Well, first of all, I wanted to just say thank you very much, Don, for the invitation to the show. I'm always really excited about talking about Rapa Nui and about my family connections to Rapa Nui. But as you mentioned, my father is a native islander. And my parents met actually when my mother came here in her late teens with her father, who came to do archaeological work, my grandfather, Dr. William Mulloy. They met and fell in love and eventually married and decided to settle in the United States. And this was, of course, in the late 60s when contact and communication with Easter Island was not as easy as we have it today. It's an amazing thing that we can actually communicate through Zoom or, any other kind of applications, live. At the time that my father left the island, he had to communicate through ham radio to his family here. But my grandfather at that time was really doing a lot of work here on the island, so was coming back and forth. He originally came to the island by ship, of course, and his first 3 visits to the island was by ship. But then in the late 60s, we began to have commercial air service to the island, so he began to come and go by plane. But as I grew up in Southern Oregon, I always had kind of, the sound and the feel of Polynesia all around me. Of course, my father being Rapa Nui, but my grandfather as well, hearing about his trips back and forth. But it wasn't actually until I was 20 years old that I made my first trip to Rapa Nui. And it was after my father had been in the United States for 27 years. So he hadn't been home in quite a while. But, even though I hadn't been there, I kind of felt it in my bones and in my blood. This is the place that I was connected to.
Right. Understand. So just for our listeners to understand, your husband is Rapa Nui. And your grandfather, Dr. Mulloy, the famous archaeologist, he actually first came to the island, in the 1950s with Captain Heyerdahl. Is that correct?
That's correct. My grandfather was invited to participate in what was called the Norwegian Archaeological Expedition to Eastern Polynesia. And this was an expedition that was created and led by the famous Norwegian Thor Heyerdahl. Thor Heyerdahl, of course, was in a kind of a constant endeavor to try to accumulate evidence that there would have perhaps been some kind of contact between the Americas, not just South America, but also North America and Polynesia. And this was a theory that, took place or sprouted up for him when he took his first wife on their honeymoon to the Marquesas Islands. And he began to kind of feel that there were similarities between things, and he began to work this theory. And when the Norwegian Archaeological Expedition was created, he was in search of archaeologists that had some kind of background in American Indian studies. And at the time of the invitation, my grandfather was working in southern Canada on some archaeological sites there. But he had been doing a lot of work in the United States at places like 9 Mile Canyon in Utah and Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. So he had definitely developed an expertise in American Indian studies. And that is what enticed Heyerdahl to invite him on this great expedition to look for Indians in Polynesia.
That's absolutely amazing. And we'll get a little bit more into Thor Heyerdahl's connection, because one of the things I want to talk to you about is the moai and repatriation of objects that were taken from the island. I think shortly after that expedition happened, and I know there's efforts underway to get some of those artifacts back, and that Norway has been very helpful in repatriating artifacts, if I understand that correctly.
Well, yes, there were small artifacts that were collected during the Norwegian expedition and were for some time exhibited in the Kon-Tiki Museum in Oslo. But there's always been a very close connection between the Kon-Tiki Museum and now, of course, the current director, Thor Heyerdahl Jr. and Rapa Nui. And they've, always had kind of a place in their heart for wanting to bring pieces back. And so there's been a lot of significant pieces. They never took any huge moai, of course, but pieces of statues and artifacts that have been returned to the island. So we have a very good relationship with them.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more. I know there's a large moai statue at the British Museum, and there have been attempts to repatriate that particular moai. But before we get to that, what can you tell us about the original inhabitants of Rapa Nui? And you can help me pronounce all this right. Rapa Nui has also been called Te Pito o Te Henua as well.
That's right. Te Pito o Te Henua, yes.
I said it kind of right, huh?
You did a great job.
So anyway, the original inhabitants, I know one of the things the archaeologists were very interested in, and some of the mystery surrounding the island is, well, where did the original inhabitants come from? I mean, Rapa Nui is the literal or the epitome of the middle of nowhere. So how was the island, and where did the original inhabitants come from?
Well, I mean, today, of course, because we have the, amazing advanced technology of DNA, they have done DNA testing on the human remains that have been found here. And it has, revealed the Polynesian motif. So, we do believe that at least one big group of Polynesians were here, and we don't find any evidence of any other groups. But, prior to the ability to do DNA, that was, of course, a huge question. And it was a question, of course, that was really brought to light and introduced to the world through Thor Heyerdahl, because Heyerdahl really believed that, it was quite possible for American Indians to have arrived to this, most isolated island in the world, just as easy as it would have been for Polynesians. Today, the evidence shows both the DNA and linguistical evidence that we are of that Polynesian group, a group of people that inevitably started out, maybe in 4000 BC in Taipei, Taiwan, and, just voyaged for thousands of miles over the Pacific until they finally made it here. We are the most eastern, outpost of the Polynesian culture.
Right. Understand. So I've often wondered, and I'm sure I'm not the only, person to wonder this. I mean, I have to tell you, when I was a kid, growing up in the United States, and I would see statues of the moai, and the impression given, despite modern technology and the advances we made, is that there was this great mystery, and no one knew anything about the island, and these beautiful statues, the moai, just kind of appeared, and nobody knew where they came from. But you can tell us a little bit about where the moai statues came from, and how they originated, and why they are such an important part of the Rapa Nui culture.
Well, the moai themselves, today when people talk about Rapa Nui, and especially people that are not that familiar with Rapa Nui, they, as you said, know about the big heads, and that is for many people something unique to Rapa Nui, to Easter Island. But actually, the moai, the statues that we have here, is the base of a type of ancestor worship that you see all over Polynesia. And very similar forms of this ancestor worship are seen in Hawaii, in Tahiti, in the Marquesas, and in all of these Polynesian island groups. But when the Polynesians arrived here with that form of ancestor worship, what they did as far as their carvings was very similar to what you see in other parts of Polynesia. But the mystery, I guess, is that what happened here that caused them to take this, monolithic art that was connected with their religion to these extremes, to the extremes of numbers. We have nearly 1,000 statues that were either completely finished or at least attempted. And the largest of the statues to ever be transported and installed on a platform is nearly 10 meters high. So they went to extremes here.
The other thing, of course, that fascinates many people and about Easter Island, and I didn't know this until recently, is the other cultural aspect, other than the moai, was the Birdman cult. And I've heard a number of explanations of where the Birdman cult came from and how it evolved. But maybe you can give us some background and some information about the Birdman cult on Easter Island.
Well, the Birdman cult, or what is referred to in Rapa Nui as the Tangata Manu, is a kind of, it represents a change that took place on the island. Obviously, the ancestor worship that was represented by the moais, because it went to such extremes, they just couldn't continue to support it. And so as the overpopulation of the island and overuse of resources occurred, people began to pull away or lose faith in what the power or the mana of the ancestors really represented for them. And so we began to see them moving to a different type of religion. The Birdman cult was originally a festival that marked the change of season and was corresponded to the return to the island of migrating seabirds. So once a year, there was this festival that celebrated the return to the island of these birds. And of course, for islanders in general, birds are very significant. They, eggs represent fertility, but for the isolated Rapa Nui people, the fact that there were birds that came to the island, nested, and then left was very significant because these people had been isolated for a very long time. They understood through their legends that their people came from somewhere else, but the birds were kind of like a tangible, evidence that there was something else out there. The birds came, they left, and where did they go? Right. It is also thought that perhaps the birds went to, the place where the ancestors were, the place where the gods were. And so that meant that these birds, having had contact with the deified ancestors, when they returned to the island, they probably came back with some of that ancestral power, something that we refer to as mana in Polynesia. Hmm. Now, this mana, they believed, was concentrated in the egg of a specific type of bird, the sooty tern. And so this festival, the Tangata Manu festival or ceremony, all revolved around a kind of competition for going out and getting the first egg of the Manutara. So this originally was a way that a common chief, not necessarily the high king, had an opportunity throughout the year to receive mana for himself as an individual. So this was very important because throughout the year when the ancestor worship was going on, the only way that you could receive this power from the ancestors is by carving a huge statue. And it was a very, of course, group effort. But the Birdman ceremony was something that you as an individual could actually, be successful at and receive mana for yourself. So originally, these two religions, if you'll have it, kind of, corresponded. They were going on at the same time, although the Birdman cult came in very late. And then all of a sudden, when the moai cult could no longer be supported, then people started to kind of move over and started to use the Birdman cult as a way to not only as a new religion, but also as a political tool, as a way of choosing a chief, choosing a new leader. Right. And eventually, the moais were no longer being carved. Moais were at one point being knocked off their platforms as this social or religious revolution began to take place. And then what was going on was just the Birdman competition. It was something that took place once a year. And it is what they were doing when the missionaries arrived. So this is the last traditional type ceremony that was going on, was the Birdman.
Are the other artifacts that are on the island that are important other than the moai, of course, are the many petroglyphs. And in these petroglyphs, they're represented the birds, the tern, the city tern that you mentioned, as well as the egg. But I've noticed that throughout the world, there is this representation, of course, of the egg as fertility. Some people even, not myself, but some people that, of course, believe in ancient aliens have put forward the notion, that there are these egg shapes that are throughout all of the world that are represented. And I was just wondering if there's any evidence of connection between Rapa Nui and the importance of these eggs and other places in the world. Has there been any archaeological connections made at all?
Between the symbolism of the egg, you mean?
Yes. Between the symbolism of the egg and other representations of the egg that have been found in petroglyphs and in actual sculptures throughout the world.
Well, I think that it's kind of a general connection in that, even for, the Christian religion, that it represents new life and fertility. But specific connections that have taken place with other cultures, I would think are probably most apparent in other Polynesian cultures. For example, I believe that, in the Marquesas, we see a lot of similarities with petroglyphs that you see here in Rapa Nui. There are bird petroglyphs, no half bird, half man petroglyphs, which is what we have here along with birds. But this whole cult, if you will have it, or a religion that took place in connection with the birds was actually also very closely connected to the creator god. The creator god on Rapa Nui was a god called Makemake. And Makemake was the source of all of this mana or ancestral power. And the birds were kind of the transmitters. They would supposedly go off, have contact of some sort with this god, and come back with mana concentrated in their egg. The petroglyph of Makemake is also seen a lot here on the island, and he is represented by kind of like a mask, or in some cases just two eyes. And this petroglyph you see a lot in the Marquesas and in other places in Polynesia. And it is very similar to, I don't know if you're familiar with the face of the tiki in New Zealand.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, when you look at the moai as well, it conjures up images of the tiki as well.
Exactly. They represent the same thing, really. It's just that here we just kind of decided to do our own thing because the early statues that were carved when the islanders first arrived here and they really started to concentrate more on their monolithic culture are very similar to the carvings that you see in other parts of Polynesia, to include the tiki.
You have DNA evidence, you have the similarities of the carvings and the statues throughout Polynesia. So it's fairly clear or certain today that the populating of Rapa Nui was by Polynesians as opposed to American Indians.
That seems to be very clear, but that does not mean that there wasn't at some point some kind of contact. And in fact, there's a lot of things that kind of prove that there was contact. One of the things is the South American sweet potato, which is seen all over Polynesia. And the name of which, in Rapa Nui and in other parts of Polynesia, kumara is the same name that they have for the sweet potato in Peru. So there are connections, but who went where? Another connection that they found recently is the study of some physical remains of chickens in the south of Chile that predate European contact to the Americas. So originally they believed that the chicken, whose origin is China or Asia, would have originally been brought by the European explorers that first went to the Americas. But this chicken that they found in the south of Chile predates the European arrival. So who brought the chicken?
That's a
canoes passed in the night, and somebody threw a sweet potato and the other one threw a chicken, or two chickens, I guess.
There's another mystery.
That's another mystery. Yeah, it's undoubtable that contact was made, but where and when?
Yeah, I just want to clear up something too for
we don't know.
Listeners, especially North Americans who may be listening to this. Many times when you say America or American Indians, people think you're talking about North American Indians. But we're talking about the Americas. And when we say American, we're talking about Indians that would have been throughout the Americas, including South America, Central America, North America, as well. And if any of our listeners ever get a chance to go to the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., you'll see that history and geography told properly about the American Indian, that we're talking about the Americas, not solely North America, which sometimes confuses our listeners. I just wanted to make that clarification. Yeah. There's so many things we can talk about here as it relates to Easter Island. But one of the other things I know my listeners are interested in, and I have a personal interest in because I worked with UNESCO for a number of years. And I was really fascinated by the fact that one of your major moai was taken and given as a gift to a British queen, and now stands at the entrance of the British Museum. And I know there have been efforts in the past to get this particular moai repatriated. Can you tell us a little bit about how that moai ended up in the British Museum and what efforts are underway to try to get the repatriation of that statue?
Well, when Her Majesty's ship, the Topaz, made its second call on Rapa Nui in the late 1800s, they, of course, visited various sites on the island. And I don't know that they specifically asked for any artifacts, so, kind of straight out asked for anything. But according to the information, they were offered a couple of different things. Now, there's, some talk that this might have been, trades for materials that they were leaving on the island, or but it's unclear. Many people talk about the moai being stolen. It's referred to as the stolen friend, but the information that we have doesn't suggest really that it was stolen. There were a group of Rapa Nui that actually took members of the crew to the place where the moai itself actually was not on top of a platform. It had been installed into a stone house. So it wasn't in a place that was very obvious. So it was actually, pointed out to the crew of the ship. A group of islanders helped to remove the statue from the installation in the house, and of course, obviously, to take it down to the ship. And the information that's available doesn't suggest that there was any kind of coercion that took place. Right. But what I always kind of think about in a connection with this gift is that I think in Polynesia in general, and definitely here in Rapa Nui during that period of time and prior to that, gift giving was very symbolic. You gave people gifts, not like we do today, like happy birthday, here you go, I'm just, you want to celebrate, but it was kind of an act of making a connection with a person and kind of a reciprocated act. So I'm going to give you this, I'm going to give you 3 chickens, and I'm going to give you some sweet potatoes, but this obliges you to maybe not right now, and maybe not tomorrow, but someday to give something back to me. Right. So making those kinds of connections and making those kinds of connections. Now, whether or not the Rapa Nui that were involved in this trade knew or really said, please give this to Queen Victoria, we don't know. But that the whole idea of this reciprocation is very significant in Polynesia and in Rapa Nui. So I suppose that this gift would have meant that they had kind of like some kind of credit going on, with a foreigner, which was important. Also, the Rapa Nui chief, that was the significant person involved with the trade, probably received a lot of recognition for this trade. Now, whether or not he really had the authority to speak for the whole Rapa Nui community at that time to give up this artifact, who knows? Probably not. But the trade was made. Now, from what I understand, there hadn't been any official requests for the return of the statue, which is called Hoa Hakananaia, until about a year and a half ago, when a group from the island, the director of the national park, or the president of the board of directors of the national park, along with the council of elders, a group went to England and asked for the statue back. And of course, they have their kind of standard answer, which is no, we don't think so. But it's been put out there. But perhaps, we've talked about that. Maybe this is kind of a negotiating tool that would allow us to get other things back. I was just having a conversation with someone in the Guides Association about, a lot of other valuable not necessarily artifacts, but like information that the British Museum has. Specifically, the original notes, field notes that were taken by Catherine Rutledge, who was the Englishwoman who was the head of the Mana expedition that came here in 1914. Her notes were never transcribed and they were never published. And she ended up, when she went back to England, writing kind of her adventure book, but never got to the scientific part of her investigation because she was sent away to a mental institution, and there she died, unfortunately. So her notes are in the vaults of the British Museum. And I mean, if they don't want to give us back the statue, maybe they could give us copies of those, and that would be great. But who knows?
That brings up the point of, you mentioned the national park. Much of the island is a national park. Thankfully, it's also a World Heritage Site, and also called an open air museum. And your grandfather established or your grandfather always wanted a library established there. So clearly there's a place for such field notes and for such research. There are hundreds of archaeologists that are now associated with the island. So that would be something that would be very important as part of the overall way of telling the story of the island, and also just having the resources there for other researchers who might come in the future as well.
Most definitely. So, I believe that our library here, which, of course, I have to say is the William Mulloy Memorial Library, because it was started with my grandfather's collection of books, and then received many other collections. But I understand today that it is the biggest center for Rapa Nui research of any place in the world, which makes sense. But yes, we have a home for anything like that.
Absolutely. Many people like myself, who have heard about Rapa Nui or Easter Island for such a long time and have been fascinated by the mysteries, want to visit. I mean, I've always wanted to go. There has been, of course, established now quite a tourism industry on Rapa Nui, and I know you're very much involved in that, and that it's of course an important part of the economy of the island. But of course, now since COVID, the island has been closed. Tourism is restricted. But what can you tell us about tourism on the island in general? What people will find when they visit the island, and a little bit about when you think tourism might open up again?
Well, Rapa Nui is one of these places that has a lot of things to offer for people that have specific interests. We have an amazing amount of archaeology in very, an authentic state. As far as restored sites on the island, a very small percentage of the ahus, I would say probably about 5 or 6 of the sites have been archaeologically restored so that our visitors can see what these sites look like originally. But many of the other sites are still in ruins, which actually doesn't take away from their interest, because the ruin sites of the island are just amazing. The volcano where the statues were carved is an amazing place. It's a place that cannot be, missed. The island is very small. It's only 64 square miles. So it doesn't take long. You don't have to, in many places you have to drive for hours and hours and then you see one site. Here, that doesn't happen, which is very attractive for many people. Right. But, we have the archaeology, of course, but then we have the culture. Our living culture really is very, very vibrant, and the Rapa Nui people are very proud of their Polynesian connection. The dance, the carving tradition is still very much alive. And now, we're kind of starting to also really think about what kind of tourism we want to continue once things open up again. And so a lot of people are starting to think about, maybe it's not just about moai, and it's not just about dancing and tattooing and all of that, but people may be interested also in to see how we survive in today's world, our agriculture, the cultivation of our local honey, the different other types of things. So I think that once we open up again, it's going to be very exciting. The other thing is that our national park is, of course, making a lot of changes as far as the operation of the park. And one of the things that they're changing is that they're requiring that any visitors to the park have a guide.
Mhm.
Now, I know that a lot of people think, oh, but I like to be by myself and I don't want to be on a big bus with a lot of, but, of course, there are options of different types of tours. But I think that anyone who has been here to Rapa Nui will tell you that having a certified guide to see these places is well worth it, because you don't see the whole story, and it's so rich. Our story is so rich, and I have some really amazing guides, people that know so much about the island. And even though it's such a tiny place, amazing things took place here. So there's a lot to see, a lot to do. I would say probably, on average, before the pandemic, people came and stayed anywhere between 3 and 4 days. But in 3 and 4 days, you'll see the basics, the principal things. If you have, kind of a more extended interest in archaeology, you could stay for much longer and not get bored.
Speaking of staying, so what are accommodations like? What will people find when they visit the island as far as accommodations?
Well, we have on the island, this kind of triangle-shaped island that's about 64 miles, square miles. We have only one modern township, and that is the village of Hangaroa. Once you leave Hangaroa, it's kind of just the open-air museum. Yeah, the 10,000 or so inhabitants of the island all live in Hangaroa. And so most of the hotels and guest houses are all in this one little place, which is nice because the rest of the island is kind of still left undeveloped and, again, like an archaeological park. Today, we have a lot of different types and standards of hotels to offer people. We have one all-inclusive, which is called the Explora Lodge, for kind of the higher end, more luxury lodges. But we also still have a lot of bed and breakfasts that are run by Rapa Nui people, and people that want to kind of get to know the people and the culture a little bit better. Sometimes are attracted to that. But we probably today can sleep, I don't know, maybe about 500, 600 people, beds, as far as beds are concerned.
And so is visitation limited or restricted or monitored? Do you only allow a certain number of people on the island at a time?
They're not limiting access to the island in that way, or they weren't before the pandemic. Right now, we have a lot of different things going on because of the pandemic. But one thing that did change a couple of years ago, and this was kind of focused more at trying to kind of get a control on the number of Chilean nationals that were choosing to come in and become residents here on the island, because our population is beginning to grow so much and we really just don't have the infrastructure to support all of these permanent residents. So now what has to happen is that when someone comes into the island, they have to have a round trip ticket, and they can only stay for 30 days. And if they're going to stay for more than 30 days, they have to get special permission. Right. But other than that, no, there's no regulations.
I understand.
Well, I should take that back. We don't know what kind of regulations there will be once we open after COVID. So I'm sure that we're going to be requiring vaccinations and all of that, but that hasn't been established yet.
Well, I know in national parks in general, throughout the world, and particularly in the United States, carrying capacity is a major issue. Places like Yosemite National Park in the United States and even the Grand Canyon in certain areas, it's limited. So as far as, managing tourism and managing people, especially in a place as small as Easter Island, I'm sure that's something that's going to be at least considered in the future to preserve it. Because you look back at history, and maybe one of the last things I wanted to talk about that I was fascinated by was that the island has changed so much ecologically over the years, and that when the original inhabitants came, they found a forested island, heavily forested island. That forest, of course, is no longer there. And I just was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. I know there maybe had been even efforts in the past to talk about reforestation of the island.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the scientific studies that have been done have revealed the fact that the island that we see today is very different from what the first Polynesians encountered when they arrived here. We're told that the island was probably at least 80% covered with huge endemic palms, that these, palms, of course, created a different type of ecosystem and probably attracted more rainfall. And so we had flowing streams, maybe not rivers, but streams on the island. And of course, we had much more topsoil. So the fertility and the possibility of cultivating crops was much higher than it is today. What seems to have happened, of course, is, what's happening. And it's interesting because this comparison has been made over and over again since scholars, have been coming to the island. And it's that, this is like what we're doing to the world is that, the population of the island grew, and little by little they had to cultivate more food. And so they had to clear more trees. And, and eventually they were left with an island that really couldn't support them. And then the population of the island began to drop. So, when the first Europeans arrived to the island, they encountered an island that was completely bare of trees, and that there might have been some shrubs here and there. And they commented on being very surprised that they even had anything available, to make their little fishing boats. Today, people have been trying to plant again. There is I should say as early as the early 1900s, there was some sheep ranching that was going on here that didn't really help out the eroded topsoil. But the sheep ranchers that came, they began to plant trees, eucalyptus trees, just so that they could have some firewood and some shade for their animals. But eucalyptus is probably what we have the most of. We have these very old eucalyptus that were planted in the early 1900s. And then in, I think, like the 1980s, the national park began an organized reforestation program, and they used eucalyptus. Today, we're not planting any more eucalyptus, and people understand that it probably wasn't the best choice of a tree to plant here. But I think what they, all they cared about was having a tree that, was hardy and that could survive and that would grow fast.
Right. Well, it's the same here in Ecuador.
Now our national, yeah. Well, now they're kind of making, an effort to kind of investigate a little bit more to see what would be best. The issue is here, of course, because a lot of people who come to visit will ask me, well, why don't they plant the original, flora, find out what the original trees were and plant those. A lot of the trees that disappeared, of course, were endemic trees, and unfortunately we'll never get them back. But others were trees that grew here when this ecosystem was completely different. Right. And the amount of topsoil that the island has lost is not going to ever allow for certain things to grow. So now, we have to start from the very, very bottom and try to plant things that will help to, build up topsoil. And they might not be the original things that grew here, but it is very doubtful that the island will ever be what it once was. I think that's impossible, but it doesn't mean that it can't be better and can't be improved.
Well, and also that it can't be a lessons learned representation, because as you were saying earlier, it's really a microcosm of what's going on all over the world. Right. Island can serve as an example of what happens when you either overpopulate or you denude an area of all of its trees. We see the same thing happening in the Amazon. So it's a representation of what can happen if we don't take care of the earth in general. And I think that's an important thing to communicate as well. Last question. You've lived an interesting life, and as a person, as a human being, just tell us, briefly, how you, as a human being, have been influenced by the Rapa Nui culture, and what motivated you to leave your life in the United States after 30 years and come back to Rapa Nui?
Well, I mean, I think it was kind of just like a combination of things that happened. If you had asked me 31 years ago, or however long it's been, um, 20, I guess 20, 24 years ago, do you think you'd ever go to the island and live permanently? I probably would have said no. I mean, why would I do that? I don't think so. But, kind of one thing happened after another. And I've always been, because my father, again, being Rapa Nui, my grandfather always, bringing home with him this interest and love for the island. I always kind of lived Rapa Nui. It was always all around me. And eventually, and I always tell people too, that I had a significant birthday. I turned 30, which I thought was significant then, and that was 20 some odd years ago. But, and I started to kind of think about my future and where I wanted to be. And really, what was important for me at that point was to reconnect with my Polynesian roots. To go to a place so that I could really feel connected and, be in a place. I think that I'm really lucky. Not everyone can go to a place and say, I have, my people, my ancestors came and were the first people here. That's an amazing thing. And when I made the decision to come to the island 23 years ago or so, I only planned on staying for a year. I was kind of taking a sabbatical to think about, where I was going to go next with my career. And then eventually things just changed. And, I met my husband, who actually I had originally met in the United States, because when Rapa Nui leave the island and wherever they are, they know where any other Rapa Nui is in about a 500-mile radius. And there's always, a big party when we all get together. So my husband and I met when we were in our early 20s and then came together here independent of one another, but almost on the same plane. And we met up again, and we were kind of just at the same place in our lives. And we decided that we wanted to be home, that being around family and being around our roots was important for us.
That's amazing, and it's an amazing story. And like I said earlier, we could talk about Rapa Nui forever. But I hope our listeners are inspired to visit the island, learn about the culture, learn about the natural history, and come and see you, because you're just an amazing person as well.
Please do. We're hoping that by the end of the year, or at least early 2022, we will be open again to receive guests. And again, this is an amazing place, very interesting. And, you're going to meet a lot of very knowledgeable people.
And get to experience, a continuing mystery. There's still so much that's unknown about the island, and so much to be fascinated about. It really always inspires a great sense of wonder. Josie, thank you very much for joining us on the program, and we will have you back when the island opens up again to tell people about what they can experience and what to expect.
Well, thank you, Don, and I look forward to talking to you again.
I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. Thank you to all of our faithful followers and to those of you joining us for the first time. We appreciate your support. I invite you all to subscribe to the podcast at lifeisastorypodcast.com. Subscribers will learn about upcoming podcasts, and you can access past podcasts as well. You can also leave a comment. We love hearing from our listeners. You can also listen to our podcasts on all podcast channels, including Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.